I'm going to mute myself and hand it over to you all, comrades. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi,
thank you so
Lara.
much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you so much for inviting us to be a part of this. My name is Juliet. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a social worker, and I'm a therapist at Alliance Psychological Services of New York. And this is my colleague, Billy.
I'm Billy. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a psychologist and also a therapist at our tiny little group practice that we're a part of.
Yes, and we'd like to introduce one more member who is not here, but she is an invaluable part of our worker co-op. Her name is Lara. She's a part-time administrator. She's a really wise comrade who keeps our heads on straight. She checks us on a lot of things that are really helpful for us to be checked on. And her ideas are reflected in everything that we're about to share about today. So it's really important that we introduce her, even though she's not able to be with us.
So these are our aims today. We want to briefly introduce the concept of cooperative ownership for anyone who's not familiar with that. Here in the US, that's just not a very well-known paradigm. And then we want to make the case for cooperatively owned mental health practices. So we're going to argue that worker ownership within the field of mental health is part of a larger dual power strategy. We want to share some lessons we've learned along the way. And then lastly, we want to make ourselves available to anyone who wants to start a mental health worker co-op of your own. So we invite you to reach out to us afterwards with all of your questions, and even feel free to pop them into the Q&A as we speak.
So let's start with what is worker ownership. So in the US, worker co-ops are less common than other kinds of co-ops, such as people may be more familiar with consumer co-ops and housing co-ops. Most of y'all probably are familiar with what worker co-ops are, but we felt it important to just kind of explain on a base level. In a consumer co-op, such as a food co-op, the owners of the business are people who shop there. In a housing co-op, the owners are the people who live in the building. So in a worker co-op, the owners are the people who work there, producing something or providing a service together. So that's what we're doing. We are a worker co-op, and our service is mental health care. So although worker co-ops can be really radical in their politics, many are not. Maybe most are not. A food co-op can just be a place to buy arugula in a gentrified neighborhood. A housing co-op can be a place to live, only if the wealthy white people who are on the co-op board accept you. In the same way, a worker co-op can be just another shitty exploitative business that happens to divide up its profits between a group of people rather than funneling them all into one single owner. So on the other hand, we believe worker co-ops can be really radical and revolutionary in their political objectives and alignments. We think of ours as an explicit dual power project, and I'm going to explain using a quote from a paper from the DSA Libertarian Socialist Caucus about what dual power is. So they say dual power is a strategy that builds liberated spaces and creates institutions grounded in direct democracy. Together, these spaces and institutions expand into the ever-widening formation of a new world in the shell of the old. As the movement grows more powerful, it can engage in ever larger confrontations with the ruling class and ultimately a contest for legitimacy against the institutions of capitalist society.
So we want to just give a brief history of our practice. So on paper, we are currently still a traditional business with one owner and two independent contractors. Our journey to official cooperative ownership has been complicated and tortuous, you might say. Juliet's going to talk more about that in a moment. So even though there's nothing rad about the documents that are currently on file with the New York Division of Corporations, we have been functioning as a directly democratic, non-hierarchical practice since October of 2018. That's when I invited my friend Lara to come and help me with the administrative aspects of the business. So she came on as an independent contractor, and we decided to do something that was close to our values at the time, which was to pay ourselves an equal wage. So we decided that there would be one hourly wage that all 2 members of the organization at that time would earn. And Cara was working about 8 hours a week at that time, and I was working more like 40. So we implemented that. That was feeling good. The other big decision that we made at that time was that there would be no unilateral decisions made. So we would use a consensus-based decision-making process. So about 10 months after that, Juliet came to join us, and that made us a small group practice at that point. Juliet's a social worker. I'm a psychologist. We both work full-time. The state requires me to provide supervision, and we've had a lot of fun kind of deconstructing that and making that non-hierarchical, even though the state sees it a different way. So we are currently based in Ridgewood, Queens. We're going to be moving offices soon, and are hoping to stay in the area. We might end up in the neighborhood next door to us, which is Bushwick, Brooklyn. And we're also beginning to actively recruit 2 additional members to come and join us. Ideally, they will be fully licensed therapists who are able to take insurance. So if you're listening to this and this appeals to you and you're in the area, please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the key processes that we've been engaged in since I joined the cooperative, which is our quest to become an official, heavy air quotes, mental health worker co-op. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the legal challenges under New York state law. So professionals, that is people who have a professional license, psychologists or social workers, professionals are not permitted to co-own a business with non-professionals. Further, professionals with different licenses are not permitted to co-own a business together. So we're kind of stymied on both these fronts. So Cara does not hold a professional license, and Billy and I have different professional licenses. So this has caused a lot of problems that we've been navigating for the past year with the help of a nonprofit called the ICA Group and a legal firm. We are in the process of creating new business entities and legal documents to achieve as much on paper legitimate co-ownership as the state will allow us to have. Again, heavy air quotes around legitimate. So this is basically where we are finding it odd that we're spending so much time and resources pursuing legitimacy in the eyes of the state. This is a conversation that we regularly come back to. And we do sort of return to this point that because we still have to comply with many state requirements, recognizing and mitigating associated inequalities, such as Billy's name being the only one on the articles of incorporation and Cara and I being independent contractors, is really essential. We do find it then crucial that we go through with this formalizing of making ourselves as close to the legal structure of a worker co-op as possible. It's important to note, I think, that other co-ops may not have nearly as much of a legal struggle depending on the members assembled. So it might be helpful, depending on the laws in your state, to organize with just people who have the same license, who all are under the same professional license. But we really love how our group of people has turned out, and we're excited to move forward with that process anyway.
So we wanted to kind of shift gears a little bit and try to do just more of a conversation about what we have been able to experience on day one of kind of the functioning worker co-op, even though our status as recognized by the state has not been achieved yet. So we're going to kind of switch gears here a little bit, and Juliet, hopefully the Zoom technology will cooperate with us on this. But if we could just kind of talk about what does feel quite different about working in our practice compared to other experiences we've had in the workplace.
Yes. So, I mean, the biggest thing that we've experienced from day one that's been a huge difference is the experience of working with comrades. And this is something that I felt so viscerally just from the first time that that I met with Billy and Cara. And one question that I remember really vividly is, you know, I was talking with them about what this might be, this kind of crazy experiment that we were gonna maybe do together. That they asked me what would make you happy in a work environment. And I had just been, you know, interviewing for a bunch of different jobs and was so used to the same questions and the inauthenticity that I had to perform. And that question maybe is a little sad that it changed my world so much, but it really, really did.
Yeah, my experience has been one of just feeling kind of a humanizing work environment,
Yeah.
the likes of which I've never seen. You know, for any psychologists in the audience, and Laura and Andrew, I imagine you're both well familiar with this, just the length of the process and the amount of time that we spend in these just like kind of crushing authoritarian environments. I decided to start a private practice in 2018, mostly because I wanted autonomy. I just really craved the experience of like being out from under the thumb of all of these different, like, pretty terrible examples I'd seen of how to provide mental health services. But once I was in solo practice, what I noticed acutely was the isolation. So it was crucial from the very beginning to invite comrades to come and join. And I remember Cara and I were just both so excited to identify in Juliet, like someone who just fucking got it, like someone who really, really understood the mission and the values. And then everything else after that just seemed kind of like solvable. Like, you know, the difference in our professions and the fact that the state was going to require supervision. The fact that insurance companies don't want to credential you, Juliet, with two exceptions. Medicaid, you can provide services under Medicaid, and also now Fidelis Care. You are a credentialed provider under Fidelis Care, which is really, really helpful for our bottom line. But yeah, just showing up to work and for you and I to have these kind of frank conversations that we've always kind of wanted to have in other settings, but just haven't really had that kind of freedom.
Right, and I feel like it's enabled me to go a lot farther in decolonizing my practice. Whereas in a traditional mental health work environment, I know and have experienced just constantly spending so much energy fighting against the pull to bring me under this oppressive clinical orientation that I had to actively resist all the time. And what we're doing is not like a safe space that is, you know, this kind of myth of perfect practice, but we do find that we have a lot more energy to devote to advancing our values, and that our radical values do kind of evolve through our daily interactions, and the process of supervision is just so radically different.
Right? And it's a lot of fun. It's fun for me to kind of actively unlearn hierarchy. It's fun for me to kind of actively deconstruct patriarchy, and just recognize like how much of that lives inside of me and how much of that needs to be kind of actively interrogated. Juliet has a really nice way of giving me feedback when I sort of lapse into some more patriarchal modes of communication. And it's really, really interesting and helpful and kind of life-giving. Like, what I notice is my receptivity to that feedback. I notice kind of a non-defensiveness. Juliet saying like, hey, like, what if you didn't talk so much during these meetings? And it just, you know, what it speaks to is just kind of the common notions, as the authors of the book Joyful Militancy describe, kind of this idea of like common notions and the ability to trust and kind of hold trust as a value up front. That's what we're noticing ourselves kind of growing into. I also just there's a quote here somewhere in my notes that talks about, okay, I thought I'd just mention this. This is a quote from Zoe Baker, who is currently finishing up her dissertation on anarchist history, and she wrote an essay called Means and Ends, the Anarchist Critique of Seizing State Power. I just thought I'd quote this briefly just because it really kind of speaks to the spirit of what we're trying to do. She says, "People who want to and are able to reproduce a communist society will not magically come into existence. A communist society can only emerge through a social revolution that abolishes capitalism and therefore will have to be created by the people who presently live under capitalism," which is like all of us, right? "Given this, in order to achieve a communist society, the majority of the population has to engage in activities during the struggle against capitalism itself that transform them into people who want to and are able to self-direct their lives and their community." So we see ourselves as just developing skills and capacities and attitudes and orientations through this process of kind of functioning non-hierarchically that we're going to need for the revolution. We're going to need to know how to relate to each other this way, not only to build the better world, but also to be able to maintain it. So that's kind of an exciting prospect for a place where you're like earning a living, right? Like I pay my rent and I keep groceries in my fridge through what we do, but it's also like alive with this kind of energy that I definitely have never experienced in any other place I've worked.
Right. It's incredibly exciting to be able to, on a daily basis, just put into practice and experiment and play with ideas that before I was just kind of thinking about and imagining and reading about, that we really get to put those into practice and see if we can take them a bit further and what they might look like in real life, and just how they can shape our ways of working and being. So that definitely comes across in the way that we practice consensus-based decision-making, which capitalists really like to promote this idea that it is inherently just more cumbersome and leads to all this infighting. And it does in a lot of ways take more emotional energy and relational work. And that energy really comes back to us in a big way, I find. Would you say, Billy?
Yes. I was curious about this. I was curious about just kind of like what workflow would look like in a flat governance model. And I think what we're noticing is just when there's more ownership across the board, we're all just kind of like intuitively responding to different needs. It actually seems like more, I don't even want to use this word efficient, but it kind of seems more efficient a lot of the time.
Yeah,
Right?
we gain efficiency, but it's not, where we do sometimes gain efficiency, but when we don't, there's something much more valuable than efficiency that we're getting that teaches us something pretty new.
Right? I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the challenges that we've experienced, because we don't want anyone seeing this right now to come away with the impression that it's been like super easy or even like super smooth all the time. So yeah, how do we think about the challenges that we've encountered along the way?
Well, so we think pretty consistently about the tension between worker focus and client focus. So capitalism placing our needs and the needs of our clients at odds. We're really made to defend our own resources through the extraction of clients' resources, or, and many of you, if you're mental health workers, you may be familiar with this term, self-sacrificing. It's a pretty big thing in our field, and we are really made to believe that like we can just kind of manage our stress through self-care practices, our face masks at home, and and then we altruistically sacrifice our time and our energy and our resources so that we can basically cover for state violence and put band-aids on things. So we don't want to do either of those things. We are trying to kind of monitor that tendency to fall into a scarcity mindset and really just seek out and expand windows of opportunity where we're really noticing that in some places that capitalism obscures, our needs are really aligned with our clients' needs.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that by saying, because we are radically prioritizing both the worker and the work, that it has felt difficult to kind of do both of those things to the degree that we would like to. We would like to be able to pay ourselves better than we currently do. We would like to work fewer hours than we currently do. We would love to have a much more generous vacation policy. We would love to have like a family and maternity leave policy. A lot of that is still kind of in process, just because of the material constraints, because one of our other main values is being able to provide therapy to folks who don't have a lot of resources. So our sliding scale starts all the way at $0. So it's tough to kind of like get ourselves the generous healthcare package that we would like to have to meet our own physical and mental health needs, when there's just not as much kind of revenue coming in as would be needed to support that. So I think that has been one of the big challenges is our radical values kind of are going in a lot of different directions. And just the sort of direct of capitalism is just kind of like slowing and encumbering and impeding kind of things that we would otherwise have a lot of energy and kind of activity to be able to do. I think that's been the biggest challenge.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we are realizing that, this balance could be negotiated differently by a different group of workers.
Yes.
Really just depending on who's there. There are ways that we've noticed we've neglected worker needs. For example, not making health insurance as much of a priority from the very beginning. If we had prioritized differently, I think that the outcome in the timeline of these things that we're trying to achieve are, it might be pretty different. I think that a worker co-op starting out would really find whatever balance would make sense for them if they're able to figure out what the top priorities are.
That's right. Right now, we all buy our own health insurance from the New York Health Exchange. Those are kind of crappy plans. They don't cover very much. And so I was asking Juliet yesterday or the day before, when we sat down with you back in August of last year, if you had said, "Hey guys, this sounds great, but I'm really going to need health insurance to be provided as part of a benefits package," I think Cara and I would have responded really openly to that, and I think we would have tried to kind of reconfigure some different constraints that we were under at the time to try to make room for that. Juliet, because of your past experience and just kind of the kind of constant sort of disempowering experience of authoritarian environments, that wouldn't have necessarily occurred to you to kind of stipulate that when we were first talking about you coming on.
Yes, when we were talking about this, Billy was saying, maybe if you had specified this, I bet we could have made this, and it didn't come out like maybe if you had specified this, but it was.
If you had only told us what you needed, right?
Right, it was my fault. No, it was very much just like, what if we had all kind of come up with a different baseline to start? For example, if healthcare was one of your requirements, and I was just kind of like, I wouldn't have said that. I would not have thought I could say that. And now I maybe could. So maybe something for future worker co-ops could think about is the relational work to do right at the beginning to make people who have been really made to feel small and what they can ask for, to make them feel a little more comfortable and really invited to state what they need.
Yeah, and so I think this would even be one of our suggestions for anyone who's thinking about doing this is get your group of comrades together who would even consider working together this way, and just start to have these kinds of conversations, right? If we were going to create a non-hierarchical, cooperatively owned practice, what would our needs be, right? If we were going to like really prioritize worker care as one of our main values, like what would that look like? And I think it's kind of fun to start with like the most wildly imaginative version of that, right? Like, let's work 20 hours a week, you know, like let's go on vacation every month. Right now, Juliet and I are dealing with just kind of like how awful it is to be a plague therapist. COVID-19 has just kind of fucked with us in all kinds of ways. And so one of the things that we decided was we're just going to take more vacation. So our current plan is to work for about 6 weeks and then to take a week off. And that conversation, we ran it by Lara to see what she would think. She was like, thumbs up, dudes. Like, that sounds good to me. as long as that bottom line is kind of coming in where we need it. But that felt amazing. And that conversation took about maybe 3 minutes because we both kind of had this like really deep kind of like acute need for that kind of attention being paid to that issue. So that's just one example. Juliet, I've completely...
And because of that conversation,
I've completely abandoned our outline at this point, so I'm sorry.
Oh. No,
I
think
just a 5 minutes heads up, folks.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Well, so that I think you know, it does go nicely sort of into our recommendations for others interested in this model that maybe we can start to kind of wind down and close out with. We have gotten, you know, through that process, like, you know, a conversation like that. Now I think we would speak up for our needs a lot sooner. The more that we're able to have these experiences and these conversations and make decisions based on them, the more we're all figuring out how to work together and make changes and be flexible in the ways we need more quickly. And so we're hoping to just kind of maybe start a future, you know, any future worker co-ops out on just a little bit ahead of where we were.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that would be one of our recommendations. The other thing too is just kind of spending a bit of time researching laws in your region, just kind of getting the lay of the land. We have learned some things after the fact that would have been pretty helpful to know beforehand. So that would be a recommendation. But really, I think our main kind of takeaway here is that this absolutely can be done. This absolutely can be done. None of us were business experts before we started this. We were just people who had kind of like a pretty radical idea that we felt could absolutely be implemented. And we're having a lot of success with that and just having a lot of fun doing it. So we want to see more. We have a selfish interest in seeing more mental health worker co-ops spring up, so that we can share ideas with each other. We can share resources. We can start to federate together to become, you know, an even kind of like deeper and more powerful part of a dual strategy or a dual power strategy. So I'm not kidding when I say, like, please reach out to us afterwards if you're kind of on the cusp of thinking about doing something like this, and we would love to provide encouragement and help and support in any way that we can.
Yeah, really. I mean, the way that it's changed things for all of us, for, you know, for Billy to invite Cara on and for Cara and Billy to invite me on, we would love to not be, you know, as isolated as we are as a radical mental health worker co-op. We would so love to have other co-ops to relate to and to build revolutionary capacity with, and to really start to gain momentum with that dual power project.
I guess that's about it.
I think it is. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, London Learning. Thank you, Mental Health Workers Inquiry, for this invitation. This has been really fun for us.
Fantastic job. Thank you so much. For those of you who do need to take a break, this is the time to do that prior to coming into Andrew's talk, and to allow those folks on here who might need to take a little brain break to come back refreshed to Andrew's, I just want to sort of summarize a little bit, and maybe we can come back to these questions together leading into Andrew's piece. You all spoke, it was fascinating and wonderful, and I love the takeaway message of this idea that maybe part of what is about articulating these radical positions is a belief that they're possible, and how these systems, whether they're capitalist systems or imperialist systems, they function on foreclosed possibilities, right? That they're just is the way that it is, and you're not going to be able to do anything outside of that, right? And so the possibility piece feels really important, which matches with what we're seeing on a global scale, right? How things become possible overnight. I tell my students this all the time, like, you know, that overnight a different way of being entirely came to be. This tells us this stuff is not organic. It's not an oak tree. You can't go to the backyard and like push over an oak tree and then over the next day you have one that's grown again. These are ideological positions that we can push up against. You know, you talked a little bit about what makes somebody legitimate versus not, and how that's ideologically based, about owning one's labor. And you know, of course, the famous Marxian sort of axiom, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, right? And you're like sort of really engaging that in a really important way. And I think Juliet said, emotional energy comes back to us in a big way. Like that's the modern day sort of like, you think you're putting so much in, but because you own your labor, there's a way in which that comes back and doesn't feel like the sludge of what we know to be the capitalist way of being, where you're sort of like being drained and with a promise of tomorrow, right? Everything comes tomorrow in 10 years at 65, whatever. And what you're saying is like, why not have our vacation right now, right? And not in like a simplistic sort of off the cuff way. It's linked into a capitalistic analysis that the promise of living doesn't have to be at 65. And what we're seeing now, particularly in the United States, is that never comes. That 65 doesn't come. Folks are working. They might officially retire, but they're having to work to supplement, you know, Social Security, or die if we still have Social Security in some bit. So I really appreciated that. And then of course, where does autonomy live and its limits when we're agents of the state, right? The article that I mentioned about Andrews kind of gives word to this, about what happens when you have the state moderate our licenses and what we do. So I'm going to turn it over to Andrew. Hopefully folks are back that needed a break to come back. That was my little sort of spontaneous music in between interlude. So let me just introduce Andrew briefly. Andrew Samuels is a Jungian analyst, but calls himself a therapist these days. He's a professor, political activist, consultant, and writer. He was chair of the UK Council for Psychotherapy, founder of Psychotherapists and Counselors for Social Responsibility, and founder, board member of the International Association for Relational Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy. His books are translated in 21 languages, and his videos can be found on his website, www.andrewsamuels.com. I'll put that into the chat for everybody as well. Take it away, Andrew. Thank you so much for being with us.
Okay, I'm hoping that everybody can hear me. First of all, I was really pleased to be asked to be part of this. And having heard from Juliet and Billy, I'm incredibly excited. What they said about syndicalism and about the problem of self-sacrifice and entering the scarcity mindset, I found it absolutely riveting, so thank you. I've divided this into three. Firstly, I'll talk a bit about myself, and I'll do that with ideas about inclusion and exclusion on my mind, about insiders and outsiders in the therapy field. Second, I'm going to try to challenge some wishful and self-congratulatory fantasies that many therapists have about themselves. And thirdly, quite briefly, I'm afraid, I'll touch on some economic and political issues. So, me, am I an insider or an outsider? I really don't know. I mean, I reached the pinnacle of being an insider when I got elected chair of the National Psychotherapy organization here in the UK, but my platform was to protest against the government of the day's plans to regulate psychotherapists by law, by statute. And I won easily because the rank and file of the profession did not want statutory regulation. So an insider. In the early 90s, together with Judy Ride, I founded Psychotherapists and Counselors for Social Responsibility, which still exists. I won't give a long talk about it, but it is a radical group within the psychotherapy field. At about the same time, together with Susie Orbach, I founded Antidote, which we called a campaign for emotional literacy in the public sphere. Now, I've been a therapist for 48 years, actually. My background is in radical theatre and social work. So when I discuss matters of inclusion and exclusion, which I will be doing, I have to confess that I benefit from inclusion. Therefore, it's very easy for me to advocate that we end the binary inclusion and exclusion. I have the privilege. Recently, I was part of a panel of an online discussion via Google Group organized by a leading American psychoanalytic journal. It was on apocalypse. I was invited because I have been writing a lot, not just in regard to COVID-19, but also with regard to the climate crisis, about apocalypse and what I called apocalypticism. Now, it doesn't matter what the panelists said or what I said, but this story matters to us now. Here's what I wrote. I am sickened by reading some posts here and elsewhere that subtly or otherwise announce that the analyst writer is communicating from somewhere safe, on the coast, upstate, rural, safe. I wrote, I can't deny such people their reality, nor begrudge them their success, but the optics are not good, is all I want to say. Here in the UK, I wrote, the references to one's garden are also ubiquitous. I got shat on like I have never been shat on before. I was told that I was condescending, that I was contemptuous, I was unfair to people who love their gardens. It made me realize even more that there is a class system within the therapy project, and that in particular, analysts, psychoanalysts and Jungian analysts are in a very special place in that class system. Hence, I want to say that we need to reform the dominance of psychoanalysis, which has been mentioned several times already this evening. Lots of therapists are not psychoanalysts. They're not psychoanalytic psychotherapists. They're not even necessarily psychodynamic. They may be humanistic, Gestalt, person-centered. They may be body therapists. They may be TA, actually. There are TA people on this at the moment. They may be working in eco-psychology or in many other modalities of psychotherapy. It is a catastrophe and a hypocrisy and a stupidity to equate therapy with psychoanalysis. And I didn't mention Jungian analysis, which is probably the first for me. The last thing I want to say in this opening mini rant is that you have to generalize to make points. That's why I said that I'm going to challenge fantasies that many therapists have about themselves. Not all therapists, maybe a minority of people watching and listening. But if we can't give ourselves permission to talk about a field as a whole, we're not worth our salt. So I need to say in all humility that I know there are people on this Zoom for whom a lot of what I'm going to say is part of their lingua franca. It's part of what they already know and believe. But I think it's very important that a minority find a voice, a projectile voice, to challenge what is still going on in the majority of instances. I move on now to the second part of my 3 parts, challenging the fantasies that many therapists have about themselves. The title of my new book is Transforming Therapy, but therapy has got to really want to change. The publishers hate it. Therapy doesn't really want to change, actually. That's what I learned not at all for the first time by the objections raised to my remarks about how everybody on that particular listserv was exaggerating how they were safe and how beautiful their lives were. In fact, this extraordinary amount of idealization went on in the early days of the pandemic. And for those of you who are interested, there never were dolphins swimming in the Grand Canal of Venice. So I think that across the psy professions, across the therapy world as a whole, there simply is not a sense of facing what the climate crisis people call an adaptive imperative, an adaptive imperative. As a whole, the therapy industry remains reluctant to take intentional action in a context of turbulence and disruption. We have been hearing about an intentional action from the previous speakers, but the fact that they have to come on air and say, we thought about it, we deliberated, we planned, and we executed, demonstrates that this is a rarity. Let's look at a few fantasies of a typical therapist. Forgive me, I want to say it again. If this doesn't apply to you, I apologize. But in a sense, if we don't speak beyond the choir, we might as well not bother at all. The first fantasy, and it concerns me very deeply, is that therapy is a process characterized by the word free. Free association is but one word that uses this idea of freedom. Core therapeutic acts are often described, following Neville Symington, as acts of inner freedom. They're not. There are no acts of inner freedom. talk to any art theorist or art historian, nothing is just an act of inner freedom. Nothing is spontaneous self-expression. There's always a context, and that context irradiates the minds of therapist and client. Please, let's stop talking about patients if we can. Therapists and clients are irradiated by that which holds them back from anything resembling an act of inner freedom. A second fantasy that I think is around in many therapists, I don't feel so nervous about this one. This fantasy holds that therapy is about the provision of safety and therefore consists of holding and containing. Sounds pretty non-controversial. I think it is an insult to one's intelligence. And the worst examples of this insult are found on the websites of therapists of all schools. I've made, as some of my British colleagues here tonight know, I've made a study, an international study actually, of therapists' websites. They're full of lies. They are oozing with gentle softness and reassurance. They talk about the provision of a safe space within which the client may be listened to. Now, I'm not saying that there's never a client who needs the safe space and the holding and containment. But that doesn't mean that it makes sense to equate the whole of therapy with holding and containment. Many of us here have had therapy. Maybe everybody watching this has had therapy. It's a fucking risky, dangerous business, isn't it? But you don't see that on the websites. Risk is a very interesting word. I've written, I can't talk about it tonight, of how risk and hope go together. You can't enter the field of hope if you don't at the same time contemplate risk. And the etymology of risk is very interesting. It means running towards danger, not walking, not ambling, not thinking about it, not shambling, running towards danger. Something very active indeed. And activity is also missing from these websites. Arthur Bohart, who is a person-centered psychotherapist and not a psychoanalyst, and psychoanalysts should read Bohart, they really should. He writes about the active client. I've played with it and written about the activist client, but that's not really the point. We know from psychotherapy research that the role of the client is far more important than we ever thought it was. If you read Michael Lambert or John Norcross or Scott Miller, you will see that what the client brings, where the client is on her or his trajectory of change, that is the decisive element. We know the school of a therapist doesn't matter. We do know that the personality of a therapist does matter. And we do know that the therapy relationship does matter. But what we don't own, based on the researchers that I've just mentioned, is that the client, the active client, that's the driver and motor of therapy. And that's a political position. Bohart doesn't take it to the political, but at the time he was writing, it made sense not to. Now, I think we can take it to the political. Trusting the client, demanding from the client. And there is some quite interesting psychoanalytic stuff on the ethical responsibility of the client. Now that sounds absolutely awful, but what I'm talking about is that the idea that the client needs nothing but safety and security and holding and containment, that idea is deeply problematic. Something else that goes with this is the notion of a therapeutic alliance. This is considered in the UK to be such an important idea that in fact it's written into the mission statement of one of the colleges of the United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy. I have problems with the idea of a therapeutic alliance because there's a kind of assumption. I don't know if you can see my hands, but here is the therapist stretching out her or his hand from a position called I am in the therapeutic alliance, and the client gradually is helped to come up and clasp the hand, thereby securing and concretizing the therapeutic alliance. Yeah, okay, I'm guying the therapeutic alliance, but what I'm saying is there is a hierarchy embedded within it that the therapist is there and the client has to move, and yet we know that when therapy goes wrong, it's usually down to the therapist. So the therapeutic alliance requires a different kind of presentation, I think. Last typical fantasy is that politics has no place in the therapeutic conversation. This is not politics as a background issue, but politics as a foreground here and now, I-thou issue in therapy. Now, many of you probably will agree with what I'm going to say. We have scarcely scratched the surface in terms of theory and technique of what a psychotherapeutic conversation about political, social, and cultural issues resting on material of that kind, what would it look like? We're still caught up in the idea that we mustn't foist our ideas on our clients, and politics is decreed to be a prime instance of the dangers of the therapist using power and authority to force something on the client. This is a self-comforting fantasy to justify so-called, scare quotes, neutrality. To critique further some of these fantasies, I would like to turn to two international examples. If I have one criticism of the speakers before me, is that they spoke as Americans. I think we have to broaden it a bit. I mean, whoever is the imperium believes it's the world. I mean, the Britain I grew up in was like that. The first is the Palestine Counseling Center, which I've become quite interested in. I would just like to read a somewhat edited extract from their website as a kind of exemplum, a kind of suggestion, a kind of inspiration, and a carefully and deliberately chosen source for that inspiration. Palestinians as recipients we know about. Palestinians as benefactors and donors we don't. They write, the Palestine Counseling Center now offers comprehensive psychological care. Beneficiaries are targeted through a comprehensive methodology, including direct intervention, that ain't psychoanalysis, and prevention approaches, as well as advocacy for policy changes. The second example, some of you will know about this. This is the Barefoot Doctors scheme that was run in China from 1930 to 1980. Barefoot doctors were not trained as doctors, you see. They were farmers, folk healers, rural healthcare providers. They did receive some minimal basic paramedical training, And they worked in rural villages in China, and their purpose was to bring healthcare to rural areas where urban trained doctors would not settle. How I would like to see barefoot therapists. I'll return to the problem of training, licensing, and regulation in my next section. This is on economic and political issues. Who gets therapy? And who gets to give therapy? These are international and national questions. Who decides this is also worth thinking about. My colleague, Elizabeth Cotton, she of an organization called Surviving Work, which is really worth Googling, a few years ago wrote a paper entitled, "How is it possible to train to be a psychoanalyst if you are not married to a banker?" Now, when I quoted this in a public setting, I got absolutely clattered. People wrote in and said, "I did it, I managed it, and I wasn't married to a banker," and so on. This is the problem of generalizing. But after a while, people got the point of what Elizabeth was on about. Who gets it? Well, that's what the previous talks were all about. But there's a problem. If it's going to be delivered, financed, I mean, by insurance companies or state systems, then there really is a question of independence, if you like. Now, let's not think about reality in this portion of my talk, which goes on for another 5 minutes and then I'm stopping. Please don't tell me there is no other way except to take people who are insured or getting Medicaid or are from insurance companies or whatever. We need to think together to challenge that limitation on all the groovy ideas that we're hearing this evening. Thinking about fees, that's what comes next, isn't it? Is a fee necessary for the practice of therapy? And I mean any kind of fee, direct payment, insurance payment, state or local government payment, and so on. Now, before you think I have just gone senile, I'm actually thinking about not only do we have to have fees, and there is a Free Psychotherapy Association in the UK, I'm also thinking what kind of fees should we have? I mean, I understand the necessity of a cooperative or a syndicated organization having equality of income. But what kind of fees are we talking about? What is the therapist's yardstick for fees? When the panelists were chatting at the beginning, I said, well, do we want to earn the same amount of money as a gynecologist? Everybody laughed. And then I said, well, do we want to earn the same amount of money as a social worker or a nurse or what? Because if we are going to talk about barefoot therapists, we do have to consider how free the services offered can be, including right down to absolutely zero. Now, I'm coming to the end. Of course, it would be great if the therapists of the world opposed the mental health and therapy industries within which they sit and work. It does mean critiquing CBT, especially in countries like the UK, where CBT is used in government-supported schemes and it's not really a proper form of CBT. I mean, fully fledged CBT delivered by somebody who knows what to do and believes in it, is as good a form of therapy as any. But that is not what working class people in Britain are offered in what is ludicrously called improving access to psychological therapies. We also need to take a stand against medication and the overprescription of antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs. These things are as important as taking a stand against the whole normative nature of so much of the therapy field, which was already touched on quite a bit by Lara in her introductory remarks. Now, please, let's lower standards. Yes, you heard it, lower standards. Sometimes I say, let's judiciously lower standards, but this is Zoom and it's the evening. Let's lower standards. Why the fuck do you have to have a doctoral level clinical qualification to get into many Jungian analytic institutes in the United States? That needs to be challenged. And in particular, in a country like South Africa, that needs to be overthrown completely, because there's a racial discrimination element in it. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't Black people with clinical doctoral degrees, but it's pretty obvious to me and to everybody I've ever discussed this with that these high levels prevent us developing an inclusive profession. It needs to be really spoken about. I'm a trickster. That means I use my madness to try to destabilize the normal. That's why I say, let's lower standards. Let's stop speaking about rigor. Let's stop speaking about the protection of the public. It's time to recognize, as the barefoot doctors were recognized as having enough medical skills to do good stuff, that there may be a level of therapeutic skill that requires far less of the practitioner and thereby opens the profession. And I think that if we open the profession in an inclusive direction, it will follow, as night follows day, that there will be a more inclusive group of clients who will step forward because they really will feel they are in a relational process, because they really will know that the people with whom they are working are not on the coast of Maine or sheltering in Wales in second homes or in upstate New York or wherever the hell rich therapists find themselves during the pandemic. Thank you very much for staying with me.
Thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate that. And we are about to open up to discussion. So there are some questions in the Q&A, but feel free to post any questions you have for one or more of our panelists, our wonderful panelists. And as people sort of gather their thoughts and maybe take a minute or two, I just wanted to respond to that last point that you were making about lowering our standards. And you know, in some ways I reimagine it as unlearning or rethinking where these standards might come from, right? Like you talked about the barefoot doctors, and we know this from, I say this to my students all the time, is thinking about an ethics of despecializing our knowledge, right? Something that I learned from Che Guevara, going into rural spaces and despecializing medical knowledge that was baked into the discriminatory process. So I take your point definitely in saying that we know there's a structural error in that type of decision process, because all of us might understand, having been in training, that more education does not correlate with better skills or better practice. In fact, I know some folks with multiple degrees that are probably some of the worst therapists because they're stuck in their ways. So, it's not just collecting degrees and that somehow correlates with good practice. And that we know that discrimination is baked into these systems. It's not within the people themselves, but it's the accumulation of wealth and access that has systemically come to be over time that creates a space for some people to show up and others not. In the context of the United States here, we see that it in no way represents what the population looks like, and efforts to diversify, just put people in that have different faces, also falls short and flat because nothing is being done systemically, right? So, wonderful presentations across the board. Let's turn to Q&A. And if you all have questions for each other as well, please just give me a heads up. And I'm happy to open that up as well. Let's start. Lucy Day has a question for Billy and for Juliet. Specifically, how does your supervision work? Do you pay together for another supervisor? And do you interact with Counseling International at all, which is a peer-based therapy network which organizes gatherings using consensus process?
So
get in there.
Sure. Yeah, I can't speak to that organization that you spoke about, Billy. Follow me up if you know about it. But I'm excited to hear about it and learn more about it in the future. So Billy functions as, in the eyes of the state, my supervisor, because my license, I'm an LMSW, so I'm not fully licensed meaning I can't practice independently. So basically, on paper, Billy, we have a hierarchical arrangement. In practice, there is sort of a direction of knowledge flow that is a little bit more towards Billy sharing his knowledge with me because, hierarchy or not, we have a difference in our experience. And so there's a lot that I can learn from Billy. We do consult on some things that Billy might want to bring to the table occasionally. We work it out. I guess we just try not to assume that the structure is going to be him introducing knowledge to me, and do that a little bit more flexibly, like whose knowledge might be really relevant here. Sometimes we think about clinical experience. Other times we think about lived experience. Like maybe one of us has more lived experience with a certain thing, and then we're going to speak on that a little bit more.
Yeah, we've changed the structure and process of supervision multiple times since we started. We feel a lot of flexibility to kind of revisit the question of is the purpose being served? So Juliet is in a position where she wants to, and let me know if I'm speaking on your behalf in a way that doesn't feel good, but like just wants to kind of learn some of the things that I have learned in my much longer sort of training process. As a social worker, you were kind of trained up real quick and then just like kicked out of the nest and like, go get them. Whereas I was kind of like held in a like longer sort of like more punitive, grueling process for a long time to make sure I turned out perfect. So yeah, some of that
minus the punitive process.
Some of that knowledge that I accumulated along the way actually turns out to be useful, and you're glad to have it. But like really helpfully, as I'm sometimes sharing things with you, like we both have this moment of realization of like, oh my God, wait a second, we don't even believe that, right? And those are wonderful moments where I'm also adding to my knowledge and skills and experience just through this process that we have. But yeah, the main part of your question is the state sees me as legitimate, and therefore I get to confer that legitimacy to Juliet.
Great, thank you both. So let me ask a question to all of you. So there's a question from, I believe it might be Karen, but the 3 in Arabic is also a'a. So I'm reading it as Quran, which is
just a little, you know, tidbit there for Arabic. So really this is a question to Juliet and Billy, but I'm gonna ask also Andrew to join in on this. Really interested to know what took you both to this political mindset. This is in the context of the United States. Karen is saying the U.S. allergy to anything that sniffs of Marxism or let alone anarchism. What brought you to this? And then what do you see are the pros and cons of challenging within a system or outside of it? Karen had a similar question to Andrew about like, how do you shift systems from within, or how do we come about this systemic challenges? And so perhaps all of you can answer within the social location that you all are in, but what brought you to this, and what are the pros and cons of working within versus without?
Who wants to tackle that one first? I have some thoughts about it.
Billy, you want to take it away?
Yeah. Actually, I'm just trying to read the text of that question again. I think it's under the answered. I wanted to make sure that I got the question right. The issue about American allergies to anything that sniffs of Marxism, this is going to shock our British comrades. There is a left in the United States. It's tiny, it's marginalized as fuck. You wouldn't know we exist if you ever turned on the news, unless you hear Donald Trump complaining about anarchists, and then unless you hear the mainstream media like claiming that he's an anarchist. So we're here, we're small, we are actively looking for ways to build power, and this dual power strategy that we're embarked on feels like a really important part of that. I would counter kind of this dichotomous question of like, is this within the system or is this without? I would say that what we're doing is a form of proletarian power that is kind of coexisting within state capitalism and ultimately competing with state capitalism. So that's kind of my answer to a different question, which is I don't see us as working within the system, except to the degree that we're all participating in capitalism by virtue of kind of living under its mandates. Yeah, those are kind of my initial thoughts about it.
Yeah, I think we try to just be conscious of how power is operating for us. You know, what we think of hierarchy as something just kind of sneaks into our social relations. But we also, you know, we think about the impact of the various things that we have to do to operate as a mental health practice under capitalism. Yeah, I mean, I came to Marxism and to be a leftist. I have sort of a family history of it. Like I have a great aunt who was a labor union organizer and then an economist, and she was a leftist. And I think I do try to be aware of the fact that tradition that was handed down to me was from a very white perspective. And so something that I think is a lot newer to me to really, really try to engage with more deeply is understanding my whiteness and unpacking that. And that I think is the more so than Marxism, something that I've had to seek out.
I'd like to come in. You're listening to a former Trotskyist. So these questions and these answers so far are really interesting to me, and I'll return to that in a moment. I would like to say something that is possibly a little controversial. You won't change the therapy profession except from the inside. However, it's what the inside looks like that matters. If what is going on outside mounts a coup against what is currently going on inside, then I think the possibilities of change are enormous. But to go against my own point just now, there's also a place for outsider projects that don't really go anywhere. That's fine with me. It's fine if the New York clinic we're hearing about, the Alliance, just stays 3 people and does its thing. But for me, and perhaps this is age, it really probably is, it's change from the inside, but the inside being changed from the outside that we're talking about, I think. The point I wanted to come back to was a phenomenon that I see, and I travel a lot, and I'm even traveling now via Zoom, but I mean, I go all over the world. I partly do it for a living, international lecturing, we call it. It's actually just gravy train in many ways, because I always add a holiday on to a lecturing invitation. That's why I've been to some places a lot of people haven't been to. But the point I want to make is this. There is a bizarre phenomenon in the therapy field in which practitioners are progressive, radical, left-leaning, seeking transformation of the world. But when it comes to what they do with their clients, they're just straight. It's particularly prominent in psychoanalysis, which I'm a big critic of, although I am an analyst, because what you find there is adherence to the rules, whether they're the rules of active imagination and amplification if you're a Jungian, or the rules against too much self-disclosure and so forth if you're from the psychoanalytic side. All of the practice stays conservative with a small c, done by people who at parties or in the corridors at conferences talk left. And this is wrong, and it needs to be challenged. I remember when I did a survey of what people do when the client brings political material into the therapy session, I got several replies from psychoanalysts that say, everything I do as a psychoanalyst is political, every interpretation is political. Bullshit. It's only political that is political. So I do think there is a kind of hypocritical problem that we've got here. And it really does make me want to vomit, listening to people talking left about Black Lives Matter, but talking small c conservative about dream material. This has got to be challenged and, well, I hope fixed.
I think this is precisely part of what we're taking up as a mental health workers inquiry, is to bring this into, this is not just an intellectual practice, right? I think we see a lot of intellectual process. My partner and I constantly talk about this. This is alive and well in academia. You have people taking up Foucault and talking about power and Marx and all of that. And then they're like lauding the, you know, the sort of election of the Vice President Kamala Harris, who's one of the biggest cops to be, right? Like there's no disconnect in that way. We see a disconnect, and what I'm loving about the conversation we're having here is we're seeing what it means to have a practice be inside and aligned both internally and externally, and some of the challenges to that, right? So hearing what are some of the challenges that come with that? I just want to link the two between what Juliet and Billy were talking about. Andrew, what you talked about as well is this idea that to be able to be aligned both internally and externally politically, this is my reading of it from what all of you have presented, is that it's incumbent upon us to engage in constant self-critique, right? To forge what Billy and Juliet were talking about as trust. Now, this is not a new concept to us who might have been lifelong activists, where you vouch for somebody, where you comrades are created through trust, through a process of trust making that falls along non-hierarchical process and a commitment to ongoing analysis of the oppressive structures in which we're all engaged, which is what you were saying, Andrew, right? Like we need to critique ourselves. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yes, it's very hard for therapists to give up their practice of seeing all points of view. It's terribly difficult to get that particular tweak on neutrality out of the way. It's so difficult for therapists to be impulsive, to be passionate, to be engagé in their work. Now, that might mean that some clients will walk and other clients won't show. Too bad. This is a problem in the depth psychologies more than the humanistic psychologies. By the way, I should say I really began in the therapy world as a humanistic psychology practitioner. I've never forgotten how we were in encounter groups in the late 60s and early 70s, but that's not how it is in the depth psychologies, where, especially when political issues are being discussed, for example, vote Biden, vote Harris, all that rubbish, that people want to see all different kinds of view, and that if somebody sticks their neck out and shouts what they believe, they're a puer, they're a child, they're immature, they just don't understand the depth and complexity of the social system, etc., etc. I'm quite happy with not understanding an awful lot of depth and complexity in society, but I am fed up with holding back. And that's also partly age. No, but it isn't only age. Mm-hmm. So I am in favor of disinhibited, impulsive acts by therapists. That's it.
Clinicians, I think that in some ways the cooperative is a beautiful example of that, right? The state is telling you, you can't do this, and you're like, fuck off, yes we can, here are all the ways we're going to subvert this and create that. So I think it matches. I think we're in clinical space, we're obsessed with this idea of splitting and nuance and all that, and I think that under the crush of some of these systems, and I've said this, like under fascism, for example, which we are in the heart of in the United States, not hurtling towards, not that we're in the heart of, that it loses its pathology. Like you stand on one side or another, that's fine. Let's just be comfortable doing that.
Yes, that's why I brought in the Palestinian therapists.
That's right. That's right.
They are in that space. There is absolutely no point in not being party pre, in not having a political point of view. And we can learn from that. It isn't going to damage anybody, or to be precise, it isn't going to damage anybody more than the conventional approach to therapy damages people. It won't be worse, it might well be better.
Yeah, which is a choice in and of itself too. Let me pivot to a question for all of you. And this brings in race aspects, which we fronted at the beginning. We've taken up a little bit, but wanting to hear from all of you, your position on this. This is from Stephen Sheehi. He's my partner, shout out to that. That's not the reason why I'm asking this. It's because it's about race. Thank you all for incredible presentations. In what ways do you think that it's impossible to lose one's whiteness in clinical practice? That is, in what ways do we just hit up against a wall that can't be easily dismantled because that wall actually structures the world outside and therefore inside the clinical space?
Yes. Thank you for that question, Stephen. I don't know if it is possible to lose whiteness. I do think it's possible to actively interrogate it. And, you know, something that we're painfully aware of is the fact that we are currently an all-white organization. That happened, as it so often does, just by kind of proximity and affinity. You know, when I was looking around for someone to help me with administrative aspects of the practice, the person I immediately thought of was my good friend Lara, who used to be my next door neighbor. And so the ways in which my sphere is predominantly white, and the people that I might think of to come and join, you know, just kind of the way that those networks operate, they do have to be actively interrogated in order to be deconstructed. So I really appreciate the question, and this is something that we are forefronting as we seek to grow. The members that come and join us, we would love it if people of color would feel comfortable coming and joining a currently all-white organization with the idea of being able to kind of transform the basis and the lived experience of kind of what we're operating from and what we're drawing from. I'm not sure if it's possible for me to kind of lose my whiteness, but I am very invested in interrogating and deconstructing to the best of my ability.
Right, and I think in addition to that being something where you know, we're really trying to think about and put into action as we're growing, it's probably just ultimately important that we're not like the ones doing this thing, that we push ourselves pretty far back from this worker co-op movement, and take on a more supportive role, because that, you know, we're still going to continue the work of interrogating whiteness. And, you know, we've done things like part of my supervision, like a written agreement, you know, involves that we're going to kind of interrogate each other's whiteness and keep each other accountable. That's, I think, probably going to be a lot, that's going to be less important ultimately than us falling back.
Yeah. Well, it takes an academic to ask the really personal question. And as so often, the academy is the best critic of the clinic. There are real limitations on shedding anything, quite frankly. I just don't see myself as other than who I am. And that is a position from which to have a conversation with people, provided they want it, and provided it's done in a responsible and related way about the political, social, and cultural material and concerns that they bring to therapy. I will always be in the power seat. Simply no way around that. However, recently I have been thinking about how to twin the power of the therapist with the vulnerability of the therapist. And here I do use a Jungian idea, the idea of the wounded healer. That means that the therapist is in the conversation, whatever the conversation happens to be, with her or his wounds. Now, this is quite a solid position, because only vulnerable people would ever want to be therapists. That is our common denominator. And there's a huge amount of research on motivation for undertaking the profession or vocation of being a therapist. Now, why is this important to Stephen's question? Well, I'm not evacuating race from what I'm saying, but I am interested in how a conversation about race, losing whiteness, shedding whiteness, whatever, appropriately moves into a conversation that explores the relations between power and vulnerability. And that's my best remark. But I want to go back to this question of the academic who makes people think personally. So Stephen, yeah, I'm Jewish. I grew up in a Zionist household. My mother was the president of my grandmother, sorry, good slip. My grandmother was the president of the Women's International Zionist Organization, and I had an epiphany, or a series of epiphanies, that led me to the positions I now have. But I can't forget that. And I don't think one should forget anything about oneself, even the vulnerabilities, even the bits that one really would like to shed. You just can't. And maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you shouldn't. Maybe it is, in the end, this is an awful thing I'm saying, I'm just speaking spontaneously. It just comes down to being human, in a way. This is not, by the way, in any way getting away from racial dynamics or power dynamics or even into the vulnerability area. I just think that who a person knows themselves to be is a precious possession. And I don't have any problem with people hanging on to it.
I'd like to try and sort of reinterpret that, Andrew, and sort of coming off of what Juliet and Billy have also said, is that I think in some ways I read that as a sort of, it's a liberal fantasy to be able to work out of a social position or a racial, and we understand them as constructs, but the way that our world is, the way that it's constructed currently, there's a liberal fantasy that frees one of the guilt that might be involved in taking up a particular position. And so in some ways, I'm hearing what all of you are saying is also our work against a liberal standpoint, where the purveyor of the lies and the lack of self-critique is liberalism, right? Fascists have a coherent narrative about what not to be.
Yes.
Liberals are the ones who want us to think that we're good, that we have these positions, that we're constantly sort of engaged in this process of analysis when we're not. And this is what comes to be, where the mere mention of class or bringing it into fore of our consciousness or race or politics causes a collapse, right? And perhaps that's the position for us to hold in mind. Let me go to some more questions for you. We have some wonderful questions in the Q&A. I'm going to combine a couple here. This might be more geared towards Andrew because it's specific to psychoanalysis, but Billy and Juliet, please, it's not just about psychoanalysis, it's about psychotherapeutic work too, so feel free to jump in. Drew is asking, are there any current examples of psychoanalytic anti-institute work where classes are open to all, where group work is used to disrupt hegemony and raise class consciousness, where analysis is radically accessible? Any thought, or if not, any thoughts on how to get that done and what would it look like? I'm pairing that with Carol's question about, that is specifically to Andrew, on how do you see training institutes and professional organizations operating the power structures you're speaking about? So perhaps, how do we see institutes doing, sort of enacting these power structures? And then Drew's question of how do we see the movement away from that, making a sort of radically accessible space using our theories? And again, open to you all.
What do we think, Juliet? What's our take on this?
So the question is essentially about, it's about what kind of spaces are either exist or can be created for radical psychoanalysis.
Psychoanalytic spaces, and even if it's not specific to psychoanalysis, what do you know of spaces that are readily available, that are accessible, that take up these issues, that maybe use a sort of analysis of group process? And if not, how do we imagine that to be? What needs to be done to enact that?
I know of some mutual aid groups in the area that are there's an abolitionist group that I know of and kind of float around different organizing circles with. And I haven't yet seen exactly what this is looking like. I think it's in the formation stages, but I recently heard about this mutual aid group that's a mental health mutual aid group from an abolitionist perspective that is seeking to create systems. This would be, I mean, it's kind of definitely more outside the system than we're necessarily currently working. They're just not interacting with the state at all, but they're providing peer support, and I think generating knowledge together, and it's also a little bit of a reading group. So everyone there has lived experiences with struggles with mental health, and that's what I gather. I'm just prefacing this with a huge, like, I heard about it, and I don't want to speak for what they're doing, and may have gotten some of that wrong. But I heard about that and was really excited about it.
There's, just as another example, there's a group here in the area called the Jane Addams Collective. They're a group of anarchist, mostly social workers, and maybe some other disciplines of health and mental health workers represented there as well. They've come up with a model that they call mutual aid self-therapy, which is conducted in triads, which seems like a way to kind of take knowledge and expertise from our field and kind of distribute it more radically to the people who could actually use the help. They've written about it, I believe, and they have a website, so you could Google the Jane Addams Collective NYC, and I think that would come up.
Thanks, Billy. Andrew?
Yes. Well, I was very interested in the two answers already given to this question, actually, and I'm sort of still thinking about what the two of you said. There's an awful lot of stuff going on. It's even going on in corners of institutions and organizations where it's not their main course. It's not what they eat at dinner, but it is going on. I'd like to make a point that's usually made in this sort of discussion, that the radical history of the depth psychologies and the humanistic psychologies, and of course we should never forget Reich and body-based psychoanalysis, which I have 3 years of. This radical history is not just an intellectual game. It needs to be taught more and upfront, really, because I think that there is the potential in the therapies for an engagement with the social that is prefigured in bits and pieces in our ancestors. So that's one thing I would like to say. There are some practical things, and I now anticipate people to say, we don't do that. Diversity in Britain is still too often taught in the 4th year of a 4-year training, 3 seminars, usually by a person of color. But by then, the candidate is thinking about something else. It needs to come at the beginning. And then there are some other things that need to be addressed. And this is perhaps a psychoanalytic and a Jungian point. Abolish training analysts now, if they haven't been abolished already. And allow young people, both in years of age and in years in the profession, complete equality with their elders and seniors. Ageism is as big a problem for the therapies as anything else. And partly it is that so many people in so many schools of therapy are old. The average age of the Jungian International is pushing up to 70. And my sadness is that when I get speaking invitations, I mostly find myself talking to a room of old people. I sometimes say to the audience, how many of you are under 40? Now, I don't know whether Billy and Juliet are under 40, but I suspect they are. And if not, they look great. But I do think that this is something that needs to be addressed. And this is actually a special problem for female beginning therapists, because they suffer, if they're youthful, they suffer the double burden of being a woman and of being youthful. If they are a person of color, it's a triple burden. How an organization addresses that is a very interesting question. I have done a research here in Britain. Nearly all therapy organizations from all schools are quite keen to avoid taking terribly young people into training. Why? Picking up on what Lara said about qualifications, degrees and diplomas not necessarily meaning much. And speaking as a 71-year-old, being 71 doesn't necessarily mean very much. And I tested this out because one of my more recent therapies, I'm always in therapy, one of my more recent therapies was somebody half my age. It was brilliant. It really, really was. So whilst there are people here for whom this ageist thing may not apply, again, across the field, it's a big, big issue that seniority, being an elder, these are terrific. And by the way, those are the people who run the study groups in Manhattan that are absolutely packed with younger people. Why aren't there study groups led by younger people packed with older therapists?
Thank you. Okay, there's still a couple, several questions I want to get to. I'm going to combine Luke's and Hassan's because they're kind of asking the same question. They're addressed to you, Andrew, but they were also interested in Juliet and Billy's take on this. And in some ways, you all have already kind of hit on this, but maybe you can give a little bit more about saying more about the position on the place of politics in the consulting room. Might that include actively introducing one's own political perspective to the patient or client as a therapeutic intervention? And then in following this, Hassan has asked, can you give an example of how to balance, when you do something like that, balance not abusing one's power in a therapeutic relationship while also explicitly bringing in critical political analysis?
And Lara, just as an apology, I told a client that I would be available at 4:30 our time, which is 2 minutes from now.
Yes. Go for it. So you feel free to go. We have to wrap up too, but I wanted to make sure to get to this.
Thank you.
Looking for the text of the question. My connection was interrupted a little bit when you were reading it.
So maybe can you give an example of how this shows up? How do you do that? How do you balance sort of not abusing the power of the therapeutic process as the person potentially holding power and introducing politics into the room? And I think there's a specific question to Andrew, which doesn't surprise you. There's a specific question to the analyst about, does that mean, do you actively bring that into the room?
Yeah,
Oh, sorry. No, you go.
I would say that we do try to pretty explicitly address that and make it a part of the therapy, but that there are definitely a lot of considerations to that. We have to think a lot about why we're engaging a certain topic. Is it for our benefit in our learning that we need to be doing elsewhere? You know, how are we acknowledging power? How is the client understanding power? And is this something that they might feel they want to engage in? How is that going to impact the relationship going forward?
Sorry to have butted in. I didn't realize who was to talk. Working with political material is something I've written too much about, and I will be very happy to send the papers to anyone who writes to me. So therefore I can keep this punchy, or try to keep it punchy. The big problem is that when it comes to working with political, social, and cultural material, we just don't have any theory. Clinical theory, I mean. It's time to talk about good ways of doing it. And that is something I've devoted decades to, and I just don't want to say any more, except that it's still a lack. Most people who want to work appropriately, relatedly, with political material admit they're not sure how to go about it. I think that could be worked on. I'd like to pick up on the power issue. Why is politics the only area of human experience where the power of the therapist is a problem? The influence of therapists in directing people towards monogamy, towards having families, and writing clinical papers that end with a triumphant account of how that has happened in the therapy are legion. That's an abuse of power. Or spiritually inclined therapists, of whom there are thousands across the world. They're working in an area that isn't political, and they are also likely or possibly going to abuse power. In terms of what constitutes appropriately aggressive behavior, not only, but especially for women and people of color, again, that is an area where you see a great deal of normative oppression of the client on the basis of the assumptions held by the therapist, or the idea that is abroad in certain areas of therapy, maybe in many areas of therapy, that growing up in a lone parent family is in and of itself likely to lead to psychological damage. That's an abuse of assumptive power as well. And I could go on and on and on. Why is politics singled out? Well, the obvious answer is politics is about power, but clinical work is about clinical work. And politics need not be separated from all the other areas of human experience where there is a risk of foisting or forcing people into certain preordained patterns. If therapists could only see that this is a risk across the board, then the risk as it applies to politics will almost immediately reduce. It won't go away because it is a risk. The conventional theorists of clinical work are not entirely wrong. There is a risk, but it's not only a risk when the material and the interaction is social or cultural or political.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to take that as that wonderful entreaty as your sort of sign out for us. And thank you so much for your process. Juliet, is there I know Billy had to run, but is there anything else you'd like to end out with and send us off on our way?
I would just thank you so much for having us here. It was really, really enriching to hear from both you, Lara and Andrew, and really appreciate everyone who came to tune in today. Thank you.
Yes, well, we are about 5 minutes over. Thank you all, folks. This is recorded and it will be made available to you. Thank you so much to our panelists, Juliet, Billy, Andrew, to the London Learning Collective for sponsoring this. Please follow both the London Learning Collective and the Mental Health Workers Inquiry on Twitter. And everybody's emails was typed into the chat. So before you all scatter away, check in on that as well. And I know we'd all love to hear from you. My special thanks to everybody. Thank you so much for taking out of your time for this important conversation. Bye-bye.